Okay, so the first topic we're going to cover is modeling, but before we do that, I quickly want to introduce you to your UI. So over here on the right-hand side, we have a few important things, first of which is the items stack, inside which we see our currently open scene, our default mesh item, our camera and directional light, which come with a brand new scene. You've also got a couple of options up here to filter out different types of items and also add all of the items that you have inside of here, and this list has really grown as MODO has progressed as a product. Now underneath this we have the properties, so if I click any of these items, the properties are going to come up, things like transform. For cameras it will be things like focal length, for meshes it might be things like how the mesh renders, subdivision level, etc. And that, for the moment, is all I'm going to show you on these two tabs. Over on the left-hand side, we have all of the tools that are available to us. So we have a couple of things in here, some basic primitives at the top, a few extra tools down the bottom here, and we have these sections down the right-hand side. So a lot of things to explore. One thing of note is that if you hover over some of these basic primitives, what you'll notice is there's this little black arrow in the corner. I hope you can see that on screen. And what that means is that if you hold down the mouse on that button, you get a few options for what that button can represent. So here I could choose to be a sphere or an ellipsoid, and if I click that and release, now we're activating the ellipsoid tool, and it forms one of the basic options up here in the top left of our UI. Now before we go any further, a quick introduction to myself. Actually, before I joined the Foundry, I was a 3D modeler for about 5.5 years. And 2 years of that was spent modeling using Maya. I actually sold my car to buy Maya, which I look back on with very mixed emotions. But after a certain period in Maya as an application, I realized that I wasn't really using a great deal of it. I was using the modeling tools and the UVing tools, certainly, but the rest of it was just kind of not really for me. And it's such a leviathan of an application that it started getting frustrating to do some very simple modeling things. And I started looking for an alternative, and MODO was the first thing that I came across. It was at version, I believe, about 1.03 at that point. And I downloaded the demo and started playing around with it, and could find that I really just could model an awful lot more quickly in MODO than I could in Maya. Now, it's not saying that Maya doesn't have a place, absolutely does, but I think in terms of speed and what it allows you to do, for my money and my personal opinion, MODO is the best thing out there. It is just ridiculously fast, and hopefully I'm going to show you why that is. And especially when it comes to modeling and UVing, I think very quickly you'll see an integration into your existing workflows. So when I was introduced to MODO, it was originally a subdivision surface modeler, and it certainly still is, but it can do extra things now as well. But subdivision surfaces, for those of you who don't know, is a very specific type of modeling, and it basically means that the computer, or the program in this case, MODO, is going to be adding your geometry and subdividing your geometry for you, giving you more detail. And you don't basically have to worry about putting all the vertices into place. MODO is going to do a bit of that for you. Now, to give you a better example of this, if I come over here, I'm just going to add a cube to our scene, and don't worry too much about how I'm doing that for now. But the kind of comparative operation for doing this in something like Maya or Cinema 4D is to add a smooth modifier onto your object. So it's not a modeling tool, it's something at object level. Now within MODO, because it's such a common thing that modelers would like to do with their models, it's actually very easy to access. You just have the tab key on your keyboard, and if you hit that on off, you're going to go into and out of subdivision surface mode very quickly. Now if I wanted to, I could do this on a per polygon basis as well, but if nothing is selected, it basically means everything's selected, and it's going to do it to the whole object. Now to give you a better idea of what's actually going on, I'm quickly going to hit O, or hovering over the viewport. I'm going to come down to my visibility section on the right hand side, and we're going to turn on cages. Now, cages, you might hear people mention this when they talk about subdivision surfaces, and the cage for this object is basically the edges of it in its unsubdivided state, or its unsubdivision surface state, I should say. So at the moment, the cage for this object, we can't really see it because it is exactly these edges. But if I hit tab to go into subdivision surface mode, we suddenly see these green lines around our nicely smoothed cube. Now the interesting thing about this is that if I zoom in on my smooth cube, you can see there are very definite polygons in here. We've got these straight edges, straight edge, straight edge, straight edge. And the benefit of this workflow is basically you don't have to come in and add in those verts yourself. You don't have to subdivide this object and deal with all of these different edges and vertices in here. I still only have to deal with this vert and this vert, or just this edge. And when I move it, MODO is going to update all of those extra ones for me. Now in terms of the detail that we're seeing here, this is down here on the object level, so I'm selecting my cube, Down here under mesh, you can see subdivision level. And if I put this down to 1, we're going to see it gets much more blocky, and you can see as we increase the number, it's going to get smoother and smoother. So Modo's doing more subdividing behind the scenes, but no matter how high I make this, so if we put this up to something like 6, we're going to get a very smooth surface, but again, I only have to deal with these very small amount of vertices. So it's a very quick way of modeling, and I personally found it for my product modeling, some of my architectural modeling, extremely useful, extremely fast to get complex objects and complex surfaces done. So with that done, I'm going to come up over here. I'm going to actually hit O again to just turn off my cages. I'm going to right-click my cube and delete so we go back to the initial setup. Now what you may notice is that my mesh item at the moment has grey text, and this is important because it means that mesh layer, that mesh item, is actually empty. There's nothing inside of it. And this is something which does sometimes confuse people when they start working with MODO. The idea that you can have a mesh item with no mesh, with nothing inside of it whatsoever. No verts, no edges, no polys. And we're told that in the UI by it being grey. So in order to get something into that mesh, I need to select it, and I can come over here and start working with some of my basic shapes. So a basic primitive up here, I'm just going to choose my trusty cube, and you can see when we activate this tool down here underneath this section, you get the properties of the tool itself. So on the right hand side we have the properties of the item, on the left we have the properties of the tool. So I could come in here if I want and start playing around with this, but my own personal preference is to just drag out in the viewport and start playing around with the handles that we get on either side of the object. So you can see on the x-axis, the red handles, I can start moving those, the green handles on the y-axis, and if I drag out this blue cube in the middle, we're going to drag out along the z-axis as well. And really I can move around, I can change this, I can even come up here and change my view if I want to, and these handles are going to stay there this entire time. I can come down as well, and now I've done a bit interactively, I could say, well, I want some more segments in here maybe, or perhaps I want to change this so it's just a bit bigger, so 1 meter exactly on the Y, and then I can go back between the interactive view and the properties view to change these settings. Now this tool is going to remain active until you do one thing, and that is hit space. And this is another slightly interesting thing for people, where it differs between things like Maya, where it has a full modifier stack. As soon as I hit space on this object, these properties are now gone. We can't get back to those anymore. The way of manipulating the object from this point on is to go in and start actually moving those edges, those verts, and those polygons around. So it does certainly require, if you're coming from a Maya background, a slightly different way of thinking when you're doing your modeling, but again, really, the speed of the application and a couple of the tools I'm going to show you in a minute, it really makes this whole process much quicker, and I think you'll find that you won't really miss a lot of those options. Now the next thing I want to talk about is just coming in here, and if I come up to my cube tool again and I drag out another cube, you can see it's maintained some of these options for me. So the segments, we're still 2 by 2 in here. I'm going to drag that out again. So you've got this big cube and this small cube. I'm going to hit space to drop the tool, and what you may notice is that in the top right hand corner we've only got one mesh. We have 2 cubes, 2 completely separate objects here, but 1 mesh item. And this is the second thing that does confuse a lot of people when they come into MODO. It's the fact that we've got 1 layer here and multiple items within it. So what happens if I want to have these cubes within separate mesh items? Because obviously if I come into here at the moment and start moving these on different axes, it's going to move both cubes together, and I want to move them around separately. Well, I'm going to go and delete my second item. And we do have cut, copy, and paste in here as well. I'm just showing you this for effect. I need to create a new mesh layer, so I'm going to come up to Add Item, and we have a basic list at the top here of things that are probably most common. Your recents will be in here as well, which is very, very useful. So I'm just going to come and click Mesh, and you can see we get a second mesh in here that has been grayed out, and our original cube, our original mesh up here, is now an outline only. Now this means it's a background item over here in our items list, and background items are basically items that are visible that are not selected. If I now select my mesh item, you can see its color comes back, and you have control over how those are displayed in the viewport, again in that nice O popover with our property settings. So over here I'm going to select my empty mesh, I'm going to come back to my cube tool, zoom around a little bit, and just drag out another cube, drag it out, and again hit space. So we now have 1 cube and another one. So both in their individual layers, and I can come in and move these around completely separately. They have independent control of both objects. So that is some basic mesh creation things. The next step that I want to show you are some of the most useful things when it comes to modeling, and really those things are the way that MODO deals with selection and these 5 buttons up here. Now, selection is something that you'll find yourself doing an awful lot when modeling, and MODO's approach to it is, again, something that's very common to the entire application in that it is going to very much speed up your workflow. The way that they've added selection and kind of moving between different selections on your model is fantastic. I absolutely love it. It's definitely worth spending a little bit of my time now talking to you guys about it. So a couple of things I've loaded up, as you can see, a slightly more complex scene to show you the selection workflow. And the next thing that I want to draw your eye to is these 5 buttons at the top. So these are the selection modes we can be in, so vertices, edges, polygons, pretty traditional. We've got our item selection mode as well, which is currently highlighted. We can select based upon materials that are applied to our object. And the eagle-eyed among you will notice there's a little black arrow in the corner of our items button. So if I click and drag on that, you can actually see that we've got our pivot and center objects in there as well, or selection modes. Now I'm going to stick on items just for now, and I'm going to start by hovering over my object. And what you'll see is that as we hover over, you're going to see all of the individual items underneath my mouse become slightly blue. And this blue outline basically tells me that if I were to click at this point, that wheel is going to get selected. So let's try it. I'm just going to click. Now you can see that everything else has become a black outline, although we still get the hover effect on it. And the reason for that is that they are now non-selected items. They're still visible, but they're now in the background. Whereas my wheel over here has become yellow because it is active, and it's also selected over here in my items list. Now, quick selection is obviously very easy with this, because I can come and see if I click now, I'm going to get that wheel. If I click here, I'm going to get that wheel. It's just nice and easy to select different items in your UI. Now to show you the other modes, I'm quickly going to hit Shift and A to zoom in on this object, and you can see my orbit is now around the center of that item. And we're going to go to polygon selection mode, so I'm going to come up here and click polygon. Now obviously switching between these modes is going to be something you do all the time, so instead of having to come up here and click, you can actually just use the 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5 keys on your keyboard, and actually the extra options in here are on 6 and 7 as well. So I'm going to switch to polygon mode, and you can see our tooltip tells us that we can hit 3 to get to that. And again, if we if we hover over the object, you can see we get our nice blue selection in there, which tells me if I click at this point, that is the polygon that becomes selected. Now there's a few ways of actually doing the selection. First of all, we can click and drag to paint select, this kind of Space Invader-y looking selection inside of here. And if I click off, it becomes unselected. Alternatively, I can use the middle and right mouse buttons to lasso select. Now the right mouse button is going to lasso select only on the forward-facing polygons. The middle mouse button is going to select all the way through the object. So very useful things, very quick to get to, but this is really only the start of the goodness that is selection in MODO. So the next thing is the intelligence that is built in to selection. So I'm going to zoom in here. I'm just going to deselect by clicking off. I'm going to select this polygon here. I'm going to select the polygon next to it. Now, something that you'll find yourself wanting to do a lot is select this entire loop of polygons. So I'm just going to hit the L key on my keyboard to do that. I can then hold down Shift to continue my selection, click that guy, and hit L again to loop that. And you can see you can very quickly build up a very interesting kind of complex selection of items. Now the next thing you might want to do is select every other polygon in here. Now to do that, I can just select every other polygon for a few, but it needs about 2 or 3 really to get going. And then I just tap the up arrow on my keyboard, and MODO is intelligent enough to continue that selection pattern. If I was to do it a bit differently, say skip every 2, again, MODO is intelligent enough to see that. And this works not only for polygons, but for edges and vertices as well. Now another thing is that I can come into here and select a few polygons. I can hit Shift up to increase and Shift down to decrease my polygon selection. So nice way of quickly expanding that throughout your model. And another really cool feature is that I can convert my selection between polygons, edges and vertices extremely quickly. So if I've got these polygons selected, again I'm just going to Shift A to zoom in a little bit closer. I can convert this to a vertice selection by holding down Alt at the top here, and you can see that all of the text here now says convert. So I'm going to be converting from my polygon selection to a vertice selection. I'm just going to click that, and you can see that you now have all the verts associated with those polygons selected. Now, interestingly, this doesn't mean that our polygon selection has gone away. We're just currently looking in the vertices selection mode. Now, if I was to switch back to poly selection mode by hitting 3, you can see they're actually still selected, and these can be anywhere you want. So I can come over here and select a random group of polygons, just completely disconnected throughout my item, and then quickly think, oh, actually I want to move those original verts again, go back to vertices selection mode, and they're still selected. And this is just ridiculously useful. And a quick example of that, if I come in, I'm just going to quickly build up a nice selection here by selecting 2 and hitting L to loop. And then imagine you've selected an awful lot of polygons, something that takes you a fair amount of time. It's quite a complex selection. And then you look at it and think, I really needed to move these 2 edges before I'd done this. Well, you don't have to get rid of your selection. You just go to edge selection mode, select the edges you want to move, activate the move tool with W, or rotate with E, or scale with R, make your change. So maybe I'll scale these down and move these out a bit. You can see I can constrain to axes using these different circles here. And when I'm done, I just quickly hit space to drop the tool and move back to polygon selection mode with the 3 key. And with that done, you can see very quickly how useful this is. The final thing that I want to show you on selection is the fact that if I come over here, at the moment we've only looked at properties, but inside the lists panel we have something very useful called the statistics and info pane. Now inside of here you can quickly see vertices, edges, polygons, and items, and these can be selected or deselected in a kind of Boolean operation based upon a certain property. So whether it's vertices based upon the polygon, vertices based upon the edge, boundary, a map that you've selected, a selection set you've made. So for something, for instance, like selecting all of the polygons in your item that have more than 5 sides, I would roll down the polygon selection. So let me get rid of my current selection there. I would come down to say, okay, by vertex, and I know that all of my n-gons in my project are polygons which have more than 4 vertices, and currently, actually I have none in there, so obviously quite good. MODO's obviously done a very nice job when I've modeled this object, but you can quickly see, okay, if I want to select the polygons with 3 vertices, so the tries in my project, I can come in, I can see I've got 1,250 tries. I can quickly select those guys, and they become selected. And this is very, very easy. So I can come in and select a bunch of polygons in here. And within this selection, I can then say, actually, I don't want to select any tries within this. So on my 3 here, I just hit the minus, and those polygons go away. Ditto with the 4 here. If I wanted to get rid of all of those with 4, you would just hit the minus, and they would be removed from your current selection. So lots of different ways of selecting things within MODO. It's something that you're going to be doing an awful lot, and really mastering those different techniques are just going to really speed up your workflow. So with selection covered, we're going to move on to these 5 buttons at the top here. So these are Action Center, Symmetry, Falloffs, Snapping, and the Work Plane. Now symmetry really is pretty straightforward. We have symmetry across the X, Y, and Z axes. Snapping, again, pretty straightforward. You can snap to background meshes, you can snap to grids, etc. So it's really Action Center, Falloff, and Work Plane that are really unique tools to MODO. And I'm going to be going through those one by one, starting with the Work Plane. Now, in order to correctly explain the work plane, I'm going to come up to File and New to get myself a brand new scene. And as you can see, we can actually have multiple scene files open at once within MODO. You can view more than one scene at once as well, just by toggling on the eye next to it. But in this case, I just want the blank default scene. Now, I'll quickly show you another way of creating brand new mesh layers inside of MODO, and that is to come over here to our primitive creation and hold down Shift. And what you'll notice is we get this nice little plus arrow on top of these icons. Now what this is going to do is create a unit cube, or a unit sphere, or a unit cylinder, etc. inside a brand new mesh layer at the origin of your scene. So I can quickly create a unit cube just by clicking that with Shift held down, and you can see we have our cube mesh layer over here. Now I'm actually going to delete that for now because I don't want to do that. I'm going to come back to my blank mesh layer and do exactly what I did the first time I introduced you to this concept, and that is click the cube and interactively drag it out inside my scene. Now, what actually defines where this is being created? Well, if we look inside the scene and take a look at the objects I can see in the viewport, we of course have our cube, which I've just created. We have our traditional grid in the background showing us where the origin of the scene is and the traditional axes that are involved with that. But we also have this faint light blue grid in the background too, that's currently sitting along the x-axis that just so happens to be the axis on which my cube was created. And this grid that we can see here is the work plane. Now, of course, as you can already see, this is defining for me where that cube is being created. And if I hit space to drop the tool and slightly rotate around, what you'll notice is that it snaps to the axis that is facing you the most. So when I originally created this, it was, of course, snapped along the x-axis, so that is where I created my cube. If I come here, you'll see it's actually rotated around, now snapped along the z-axis. So if I was to come up and click cube again and start dragging out, that is where we create our object. Now again, if I hit space and drag down a little bit, just rotate, you can see now our work plane is sitting on the y-axis, on the original grid plane itself. So if I was to come and create a final cube, that is where it would be created. So that's one use of the work plane, so discerning where things are created if you create them interactively within your scene. Now another use is going to be very, very apparent if I come back to my original scene, come in here and click this door at the back of the tank. Now this door is currently sitting at a bit of an angle. In fact, I'm just going to quickly pull it outside of that group and hide everything else so we can see it. And again, Shift A just to center our orbit around it. Now you can see it's slightly tilted, and one of the things that I used to have to do as a product designer was come in and add things like bolts and detail so that it sits directly on the surface of this model. Now as this is just slightly offset here on a single axis, you could create your bolt, you could come into a side view and fairly easily rotate that into place. However, let's imagine that this door is actually not sitting just like this, quite simply rotated. Let's actually grab it. I'm going to hit E for the rotate tool and rotate that completely randomly off axis. So on all three axes, it's now sitting slightly skewed. Now to create a bolt and sit it perfectly on these center polygons here, well, that would be quite difficult. And to do that a lot across your entire model is going to take quite a bit of time. Now the work plane can actually help us out here. So what I can do is grab a bunch of polygons. I can come up here to this work plane drop down, and inside of here the second option down is align work plane to selection. And when I click that, look what happens to our faint blue lines in the background. They now snap and align perfectly to those selected polygons with the origin of the grid in the center of the polygons themselves. Now if these polygons weren't all in a single plane, if they were something like around the surface of a curved object, the grid, the work plane, would align to the average normal of those selected polygons. But what this now allows me to do is come in, create a brand new mesh layer. I'm going to zoom around. I'm going to come up to my cube tool again, the trusty cube, and I'm going to drag out a cube. And what you can see is that it's aligned perfectly on the work plane, aligned to those selected polygons. And of course I can move this around, I can place it, and the interesting thing is that if I grab the W key to activate the move tool, which you don't have to press space then, you can move straight to a translate tool, and it's the same as hitting space and then going to move. And you'll see that I'm moving it along the work plane axis. So all of my rotate, scale, and move tools are aligned to the work plane. The second thing that we can do is go to an orthographical view. So if I come up to this menu and go to, say, top, you can see that this is now aligned to the work plane as well, and so are the left and the front views, so the side and front views too. Another way of quickly switching view, just so you know, is to hold down Control and space in the viewport, which brings up this popover, and I can very quickly pop back to any of the views listed here just by having it selected and releasing my hotkeys. That's Control and space, very, very useful and time-saving. So what this allows me to do is quickly come in, grab some content, maybe rotate it into position a little bit. I can do some extrusions, some bevels inside of here, all aligned to this object, all aligned to the work plane. I can come in and maybe use the duplicate tool, maybe want to use a clone in here, click to activate and drag it out, and you can see we get 5 copies in here as discerned over here in my properties. I can move this into position, something a little bit like that, space to drop the tool, and I'm done. Now at this point I really want to reset my work plane, so I'm going to come up again to this menu, hit reset work plane at the top, and we're back now snapping automatically to the closest axes. So that is a quick introduction to the work plane with inside MODO, and it really is something that once you start implementing in your workflow, it's going to speed up these slightly frustrating situations that I'm sure you're going to come across a lot. Now to explain the Falloffs, I've isolated a tire from this model, and we're going to do something a little bit funky with it that you probably wouldn't ever want to do to a model like this, but it will show the effect of the Falloffs quite nicely. Now the first thing I want to do is go into a front view, so I'm going to hold down Control and space again. Actually, let's go into a left view for this so we can see this straight on. Now with that done, the effect that I want to have is to turn my lovely circular tyre here into something a little bit more like an egg shape, so a little bit thinner at the top than it is at the bottom. Now doing this manually, obviously trying to move the vertices and edges and polygons yourself, well that's kind of insane, you probably wouldn't want to do that. In Maya or Cinema 4D this would probably be something like a lattice deformer, but again that's applied on a per object level, so it can get a little bit confusing to maintain those things. Well, in MODO we have the Falloffs that you can see up here, and these are very, very modular, so just like the work plane can be used with any of the tools within inside MODO, so can the Falloffs. And if I click this, you can see that we have many different Falloffs available to us. So you can use things like images, weight maps, noise, lots of different options in here. I'm just going to stick with the basic linear for now. Now when you click the Falloff, it will be ticked in this list and it will also appear over here in the left hand side. And I'm just going to activate that by clicking and dragging in my UI. And you can see we drag out this triangle that is of course thicker at one end at the top here than it is at the bottom. So in theory this is going to fall off the effect of any tools that I use, so they have more effect here at the top at the wide end than they do at the thin end. Now I'm going to activate my tool, so in this case the scale with the R key, and I'm just going to move this Z-axis and just pull that in slightly. You can see that we're having much more of an effect at the top of our object than we are at the bottom of our object. And of course we can move these handles of the Falloff to interactively change the effect that's having on our model. And of course this isn't just in side view or the left view. I can go back to my perspective and move this in full 3D as well, which is kind of cool. Now, as I said, this works with any of the tools you can use. So at this point, I could activate my rotate tool and start activating kind of a little bit of a weird looking around kind of animation on this. Could be very useful for that kind of TV ad that you might see around a little bit. But at the moment, we're just doing this with a straight linear Falloff. If I come down to my properties panel on the left, you see we have shape preset. Inside of here, I can choose to ease in my effect. I can choose to ease out my effect, or even add a completely custom curve, which is going to appear in that triangle within the UI. So this is a very quick intro to the Falloffs that you have available to you within MODO, and again, it's completely modular, so this Falloff effect can be applied to any tool that you want to use for your modeling process, and interestingly, it can be used for other things as well, such as UVing, painting, sculpting, etc. So that's a quick look at the Falloffs inside of MODO. Now the final thing I want to touch on are the action centers up here. Now, I'm currently in polygon mode, and I have nothing selected, and in MODOland, this basically means that everything is selected. So anything that I do, like moving, scaling, rotating, whatever, is going to affect all of my polygons. Now, of course, this is the same as me double-clicking on the mesh and selecting everything, but I'm just going to leave it unselected for now, like that. And what I can do is activate the Move tool. Now when I do that, you expect a few things most likely. First of all, you'll probably expect the tool to position itself in the middle of your selection, which, as you can see, it has done. You'll also probably expect for the tool to be aligned to the axes in the scene. So Y is indeed up, X is along the red, and Z is along the blue here. Now, for the most part, this is pretty much what you want all of the time. You're going to want to move this along a specific axis, etc. But sometimes you're going to find yourself in a position where you want a bit more control over not only where the center of the tool is, but the axis that it works on. And that's exactly what we find in this menu here. Now, if I roll this down, at the top here, above this little divider line, these are all presets for things that you can use. And this is going to be setting both the center and the axis of your current tool. Now, we also can set those individually in here, so center or axis as well. Now, I'm quickly going to show you just a few uses of this. So currently, I'm on basically automatic, which is up the top here. And this means that we're going to go snap correctly to the center of whatever selection I have, and it's going to be the axis of our world. So you can see, again, Y up, X is red, Z is blue here. But this is not necessarily always what we want, so let's zoom up to the top. I'm just going to show you a quick example. If I grab these faces here, I'm going to hold down Shift and up to grow my selection by 1. Now let's say we want to rotate these faces around this edge. Now clearly if I activate the rotate tool, well, that's not going to happen here, is it? It's centered in my selection and the axis isn't anything like this edge here. So I can come up to Action Center and come down to Element. Now with Element selected, I can right click on any element, be it a polygon, be it an edge or a vertex in our scene. I'm going to highlight this edge here and just right click. That will activate the tool around that element. So you can now see that we're perfectly positioned in the center of this edge, and our axis is perfectly aligned to it, so I can rotate very easily around that. Now at any point I can come in here and change my element again just by hovering and right clicking to continue working and rotating. So this is very, very quick at this point. There's not a lot of keyboard shortcuts to move around and change your center of your tool. It's just a quick right click to get this working. Now another example is, let's say we want to take all of these faces here. So I'm going to select this one, this guy, and just tap up to continue my selection pattern all the way around my object. I'm then going to hold shift and hit up a few times to select all of these treads here. And first of all, I'd just like to say, how quick was that? That was kind of ridiculous. Doing that manually would just take a very, very long time. Now let's say that I actually thought these were a little bit big at this point, and I want to scale down every single one of these, but maintain its kind of position on the curve around our wheel. Well, with a traditional tool, if I go back to my automatic mode, of course, this isn't going to work, is it? Because I'm going to scale these down, it's going to scale them all out from the center of my selection. What I ideally want to do is scale each one locally, so every section of the tread on its own axis. And again, of course, MODO gives us the option. I'm going to come up to Action Center and click on Local. Now with this in place, it's going to snap to the center of one of our selected treads, but if I use the Scale tool at this point, you can see they're all scaling along the independent axis. So we can very, very quickly scale these down and move them out or into position. And something like that without this kind of precision would just take a very, very long time. Now I've mentioned modularity an awful lot when covering some of these tools, and to give you an example of exactly how modular this is, I'm going to come down to the right hand side, and where we've got properties currently, come across the top and you'll see lists. Now inside of here we've already had a quick look at the selection options at the bottom, but in the middle we have something called the pipeline or the tool pipe, and this describes everything that you have currently activated to make up your current tool. So I'm just going to quickly get rid of this by clicking local as well, which will clear out my current action center and axes, so this entire pipeline is blank. Now if I activate the move tool, so just hit W, what you'll see is that this will now appear inside our pipeline, because this is the tool we have active. If I come up and then add in a fall off, maybe a linear fall off, you can see that this is now here as well. If I come in and then add an action center, maybe something like element, this too gets added to this list. Now you can quickly come in and turn some of these on and off, maybe reorder them in here, and you can save any of these out as a custom preset or a custom tool. And what I find is that many people who see MODO for the first time, sometimes there won't be some of the tools that they love from other applications. But really what you can do is come in and use this modularity within the app to create those custom tools, right click and save them out as a preset, and then load them whenever you want. So this modularity is key throughout the entire app, not only with modeling, but with all of the other sections I'm going to show you as well. So that's about it for modeling. I'm now going to move on and take a quick look at the UVing inside of MODO.